There's almost this prevailing notion that whenever the current expansion is out, it's like the worst expansion that's ever existed. There's obviously some, not it's not always universally true. Like I don't really remember that many people complaining about Wrath, but I do remember in Wrath people were already talking about how good Classic was. So I think there's like just a lot of people have like bad memories in this game, and there's a lot of complaining happening about obviously the current expansion because they're talking about things that are happening to them as they're talking about it, so it's easy to see why this happens. But for me, I've always been the exact opposite. I always feel like the current expansion is the best expansion, even when looking back, it's not. Like, even if we go back to like Cataclysm or Warlords of Draenor, I would have said the same thing. I probably said it in videos too, especially in WoD. Like, I really did enjoy WoD at the time, and I did think, it was an improvement on MoP because the way that the World of Warcraft expansions typically work is they are always improvements on the previous one, right? There's always systems that are there from the previous one that are then just built on, and things get better and better and better. And it's usually the current expansion that really utilizes the previous expansion's most important content. Like, for example, when Shadowlands started to redesign class stuff, it's now Dragonflight that's actually capitalizing on that. And it gets to be like to a question where you're thinking, like, maybe they did that in Shadowlands knowing they would do that in Dragonflight. And I do think that's true. So, Shadowlands got a lot of heat at times, but I do think the systems that we got there were the progenitor of what's now coming in Dragonflight. To me, Dragonflight looks like, without question, the best expansion ever, but it's because it's targeting things that I absolutely love about the game, like classes and professions, and just like the overall exploratory feel of the game returning. Hasn't really had that in a very long time, honestly, maybe even since Classic. So, MoP, had some feels and themes to that, but we're finally getting back to that in Dragonflight. But Shadowlands was the progenitor of it in my eyes. I really do have to say that the one thing that Shadowlands did really, really well with its zones and like concepts was that they felt like very unique and like huge areas that you would never really understand entirely. Ardenweald became something to me that I will never forget. And as many people didn't like the Covenant system, especially on launch, it's definitely the thing I like the most, honestly. Shadowlands did, nothing really poorly in my eyes, but it did one thing absolutely spectacular, and that is this feeling that you're in a covenant. Between the zone, the music of Ardenweald, the feel, the aesthetic, everything about the actual physical place. In the tree house, quote unquote, the place that you set your hearth there, all of the NPCs in the area around that. I am going to deeply miss them, and I already do, honestly. It's actually kind of emotional because I really love this place. Like, I have not fallen in love with a place in World of Warcraft. I don't know if there's ever been as deep of a connection to a single place as Ardenweald and me have had. And it, really transformed my gameplay throughout the entire expansion. There was no question about really ever switching. There was like a small time where I was thinking about it, but I also like Bastion for the same reasons, but Ardenweald is just stronger to me. So I will miss it. I will miss Blue Death and Decay. I will miss Soul Shape. I will miss everything that came with Ardenweald, the music. Yeah, even the mission table being overpowered. Really, nothing disappointed me about Ardenweald. Okay. Now, I really did not like Meldraxxus, and Revendreth was all right. I like the concepts of Revendreth, but I just don't really like how dreary it was. I like the fact that it's just like a massive cityscape that was kind of all destroyed, and navigating it with the Covenant spell was actually like something that you would really have to do early on. I always had this in my head, like I want to do like a full, exhaustive look at that zone, and that's still something that I might do at some point. But yeah, there's just nothing like Ardenweald, and I don't know if there ever will be again because it's really the music and the ambience. But I just love that forest feel. So I'm doing a leveling challenge now, a warrior, and it's the same reason that I love the night elf starting zone because it just feels almost like otherworldly. I think is the way to put it. Otherworldly for sure is the way because there's no, it's just not something you'll ever gonna see again in this game. And so I think a lot of people dislike the zones of Shadowlands. They dislike the fact that they're all disconnected or that They seem to be so distant from each other, but I think that was the strongest point of the expansion, and it delivered that extremely well. And again, because of the covenant system, basically, the covenant system was meant to be a new layer on top of classes, and a lot of people didn't want that. And so when we talk about like the game receiving feedback and being hesitant to act on it, we have a big problem here because right now Blizzard's trying to make something, or at that point, Blizzard was trying to make something that was going to transform the way class and like race, then class, then covenant. That was going to transform the way you chose what character you're playing. Of course, there's a big factor here of balance, right? A lot of people are only playing the game to try to be the perceived best they can be, which is regrettable to hear them do that, but I get why they do it. So that is obviously not going to work with this new system. Just like if they added a new class, it's going to be the same problem, right? But the problem is you force it on everybody. So no matter who's playing what, they have to pick a covenant. I think it was handled well, though. I think in terms of the RPG element, I loved it. And I would definitely say, maybe they shouldn't consider doing it again, but maybe, if they did something similar to that again, just without any power associated at all, I would be fine with that. Certainly fine with that. Like if they did it in Dragonflight, I would have loved it. Or you choose which Dragonflight you actually want to assign like your character to, and then you just got a slew of cosmetics that didn't actually, yeah, I don't know. Like it didn't increase your power at all. Maybe I don't know, because I didn't mind the power. I don't really care. I played Night Fae the entire expansion. I did probably like 10 keys as something other than Night Fae. And yeah, it's just my favorite. That's all there is to it. I made a whole video about why I was playing Night Fae even when it was at the worst. I played it in season one. It was absolutely ridiculously bad then. I played it in season two. It wasn't much better. Season three was finally starting to get better. And now it's funny, in pre-patch, people are actually using it as the best one. And the Covenant has been the only reason. I never cared about the strength. I never really liked the way it operated, to be honest. Like the fact that you had to really pay attention to the stacks. But I feel like it was actually kind of fun because it became like a little mini game every time we were in combat, and I just loved the way it looked. So I just want to say that about the Covenant system because I think a lot of people did not. So there was some legitimate criticisms, of course, and we made whole videos on this. I don't really want to go over it again, but I think a lot of people, especially by now, just don't remember that conversation. You know what I mean? Like they don't really remember what it was like when it launched because that was over a year ago now. It's actually wild to think that it's been not this way for longer than it was this way, right? Yeah, it's 7.1.5, was it 2.5? It was like in the middle of the second season, so I guess it was 7.2.5. They changed it, and the game has changed ever since. And it's a shame that they changed it, but it doesn't really matter for me because the things I loved about it are still there. Now, in terms of the events that have unfolded over Shadowlands, you might think that's my least favorite expansion ever. Unfortunately, I don't really want to go into it again today, but a very, very long time, guild that I was a part of, a raid leader, and eventually GM of. It collapsed, and basically my disinterest in mythic raiding had taken precedent at that point. So a long time group of people have separated over Shadowlands, and I would really have to blame the expansion for that. They continued to make mythic raiding harder and harder, and that's probably not going to change in Dragonflight. It was just like this steady increase every single expansion, and the growing weird thing in the community where nobody actually wants to make friends anymore. They just want to hop from guild to guild and be really anti-personal, and I don't know. It really bothered me. It was like actually huge anxiety every time I was trying to recruit somebody anymore because you never know what you're going to get, and I don't know, made some amazing friends. Obviously, that's an understatement along the way. But yeah, I think if this happened in any other expansion, I would say it would be a real dark cloud over the expansion for me. But I actually am, I'm trying to not blame the raids for it because I do think that the raids were actually, they were well made. There was really only a few encounters throughout the entire few seasons that I did raid Mythic that I felt were really unfair. And unfortunately, Painsmith was one of them. But Ner'zhul is another one, very, 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 very poorly. That's probably the worst designed fight they've ever made, actually, just in terms of its actual functionality. But overall, I think the rating was really good in this expansion. I really did like Castle Nathri. I think it's one of my top 5 raids ever. It certainly is my favorite raid of the last few expansions. And I definitely like Sepulchre now, but I haven't done it, of course, on Mythic. And I love the Fated concept. So I think rating is at a very high point, even though it completely, yeah, it changed my life, actually, Shadowlands rating. Really, that's an understatement to say that, but we'll just try to move on from that. Yeah, it changed my whole life, and I still really like it, even though it really had a negative impact on me at one point. And Dragonflight rating, I'm sure, will be even better because it does seem like they're, again, building on what they learned from Shadowlands. So, really, I would say that's probably the best part about Shadowlands is even though the start things were a little bit rigid. Also one of the things that we talked about at the beginning was the lack of Titan forging or the lack of systems in Mythic Plus to encourage gearing for a long term. And so when the game launched, it had nothing. It was literally just gear, and everybody was like unhappy with that. And I was trying to tell people, I'm like, listen, man, you asked for this. This is what I'm saying, dude. Like, this is a kind of a serious problem here. You asked for this. Just realize that, right? You begged and screamed about Titan forging for so long that you had Blizzard remove it, but there's no backup plan. You just had them remove something, and there's nothing in place. So then I found out that they were working on the Valor system pretty early on, and I was really excited about that because that is now the replacement. By now, after season 1, we now have a fully fledged Valor system and a fully fledged score system. So Mythic Plus has now been completely controlled by Blizzard systems, which I love. It's so much better than having a third party handle it, especially one so reluctant to actually act and try to make the game better, like Raider.io, which is a shame. But regardless, it's really nice that Blizzard now handles it. We'll see what happens with Valor and Score in the future. But I do have optimism for that because they now have a vested interest for making it the best version of itself. And I think the season 4 situation was probably the most fun, where there was no Valor cap. But of course, it's unrealistic to expect that to happen again because this season was kind of an experimental season in the fact that power wasn't as important for progression. But yeah, you can't really have no Valor cap when Mythic Plus is so easy to get gear from it compared to Raid. I hope that they will be more likely to consider doing that in the future, earlier, especially earlier. But I would say that all of these things that we just talked about today are great examples of why Shadowlands was actually an amazing expansion, because it feature wise may not have been everyone's favorite or you dislike things at times, but for me, it was about the way the game was delivered. And for the first time, it seemed like they were actually like they were considering other options. And I don't necessarily think that's a great thing. Like we talked about a few examples of why it's not, especially the Titan forging thing. But I think if they've gotten to a good middle ground right now, we just talked about this with the thundering effect, and it really hit home for me. It seems like they're now willing to be more kind of translucent on their development process. At one point, they would not do this. Okay. And I actually just heard a conversation about Diablo. This is very interesting. All of a sudden, I'm very interested in Diablo. And I just heard this conversation about them wanting to add a way in Diablo 3 to prevent duping and item, basically hacking. And that was the real money auction house. And nobody wanted that, like from Blizzard. And obviously, it didn't last very long. But they felt that was the only way to curb real money trading, and it actually didn't work. So they just removed it. Like it didn't work. Like it didn't do what they thought it was going to do. So they removed it. And I was like, wow, that's a pretty good idea. Sometimes I feel like WoW's kind of slow to do that. And I think that's the best part about Shadowlands is it finally seems to have broken that barrier because they clearly implemented a system that, I'm going to say it didn't really work. The Covenant system had a lot of flaws, even though I loved it and I wish it stayed the way it was. It didn't really work. And the community outcry, I'm sure, didn't hurt the situation. It elevated the pace of the situation, but they acted in a timely manner. That was something that a lot of people thought would only happen at the end of an expansion. And honestly, think about that. If the covenants not being locked like they were was a season 4 expansion feature, that would, that would have been pretty groundbreaking. Season 4 was already kind of groundbreaking. I'm sure they had plans for season 4 this whole time. So that could have been a season 4 thing, right? But they actually elevated it. They presumably spent man hours to push it from wherever it was to then. We also saw things like cross faction come in to Shadowlands, which is another huge feature that people have been pretty much demanding for a long time. And I think in general, like they're willing to do these things and be more open about them as well. Like we saw a lot with Dragonflight Beta. They were basically saying like, "Hey, this is where we're at. Why don't you guys give us some feedback on where we're at, and we'll continue to iterate." And like we said with the Thundering affix, it's very likely that there would have been 4 or 5 iterations of this affix internally, and they would be like, "All right, well, we're not going to show you our cards until we're sure we have something good." But now they actually trust the community to say like, "Oh, maybe they can help us make something good." Fortunately, sometimes they can't, but I do think as long as it's like, no, this is what we're doing. You guys can help us do that, but this is what we're doing. You know what I mean? As long as they're like, because the thing I fear the most is Shadowlands said, and I think this is actually what happened, to be honest. But Shadowlands launched with the Covenant system, and people were immediately talking about its flaws, right? The things that they weren't going to be happy about. And I even said this at the time. I was like, what do you want them to do about it? Like, you want them to to not add covenants? The whole game is based around it. It's not going to work. You know what I mean? It's not possible. Like that's just not possible. That's like saying like, oh, Dragonflight should not be a feature. It's like, or dragon riding should not be a feature of Dragonflight. It's like, no, that's not going to happen. You know what I mean? That's basically what was being asked for. So I think they acted in the best like interest of the game and the most timely way they could. Because if you did it too early, it would completely compromise the game. And if you just did what a lot of people just asked for, it would actually just that would be it. The expansion would be over. There wouldn't be any content at all. So I think you got to be really careful about who you listen to and for what reasons. But I am very pleased that Shadowlands seems to have been the table setter for Dragonflight's amazing communication, amazing willingness to listen to the community. And I think, we're in a really good place here going forward. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on Shadowlands, especially those who didn't like it. I guess I would love to hear your thoughts too, because all throughout the expansion, I heard a lot of people say this expansion isn't good. But honestly, I heard that in BFA, and I kind of reluctantly disagreed. There was some things that I loved about it, honestly, but some things that I always thought were a little bit odd. And now looking back at BFA, especially compared to Shadowlands and Dragonflight, it's not a very good expansion, but it's still very good at the time. And I would have said the same thing about Legion, maybe in the opposite direction. A lot of people weren't necessarily complaining about things, but I didn't like about Legion. So it's very interesting to hear actual reasons, because I think in the Shadowlands version of these complaints, the only real complaint I ever heard, like the only one I ever gave any credence to, was the Covenant situation, and that was fixed within a year of the expansion being out. So it wasn't even a year. I really, yeah, it wasn't very long. I don't know how long it actually took to fix, but it wasn't long. And other than that, I really don't know of any actual criticism that I believe in. It's just usually like kind of mindless stuff that doesn't make any sense to me. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially if you have real reasons why you didn't enjoy Shadowlands and what you're hoping that Dragonflight will be different on. Because I think maybe like the whole borrowed power. I really hate using that term because it really doesn't make a lot of sense, to be honest. But yeah, I actually can understand that as well, I guess. But to some degree, the whole game is borrowed power. Even tier sets and gear alone will be something that you'll be feeling that same way on. Like, oh, I can't play my alt until it has gear. You know what I mean? So, but let me know what your thoughts are, and I hope you enjoy this retrospective on an expansion that I am going to miss dearly. I really, I have to say that even though it had such a potentially negative impact on my life at one point, it's my favorite expansion, honestly, emotionally, and I felt the most connection to it. I felt the most engaged by it, and it's hard to admit this because it had such a negative impact on my life. But it's the expansion I'll probably always never forget. Like it's one that I will always, they'll always be out for as long as I play WoW. I'll always remember logging into Ardenweald and, the feelings that gave me and everything else that occurred throughout Shadowlands. So, Let's move on to Dragonflight, man. I can't wait. I'm really, really excited about Dragonflight. For as much as I love Shadowlands, Dragonflight looks to be even better in all the same ways.